the stepson who hated me for saving his mother. I never thought I'd be the villain in someone else's story, especially not in the life of a kid I'd tried so hard to care for. But here I am, 39 years old, 12 years into a marriage, being called heartless by a 17-year-old who spent over a decade wishing I'd simply disappear from existence. Let me tell you this whole twisted story from the beginning, because it's not just about a college fund. It's about manipulation, parental alienation, and how one man's lies poisoned a child against everyone who tried to help him. How it all started. I'm married to Emily, who's 38. We've been together for 12 years now, but Emily came into this relationship with baggage, the human kind. Her son, James, now 17, was the product of her previous relationship with a man named Dan. They were never married, but they were together long enough to have a child and build what looked like a life. Then, Dan got caught cheating with a coworker. Emily left him immediately. They worked out a 50-50 custody arrangement for James, and Emily began rebuilding her life. About a year after she left Dan, I met her. We clicked. We fell in love. We started building something real together. Dan, meanwhile, didn't waste any time either. He married his affair partner, let's call her AP, just a year after Emily left him. Emily and I got married shortly after that. It felt like we were all moving forward, starting fresh, building new lives from the rubble of the old ones. Except James never got that memo about moving forward. The relationship that never was. From the very first day I met James, our relationship was complicated. And I'll be the first to admit my mistakes here. When I first met him, he was just a toddler, and I was nervous as hell. I'd barely been around small children in my life, and I had no idea how to act around them. So I overcompensated. I came on way too strong, using this ridiculous over-the-top baby voice that Emily later told me made me sound like a circus clown on 2 cartons of Red Bull. Looking back, I cringe at the memory. I was trying so hard to make this little kid like me that I probably scared him more than anything else. When I realized I was pushing him away rather than drawing him closer, I backed off. I gave him space. I tried to just be present without being overbearing. Over the years, James and I settled into what I can only describe as a tense acceptance of each other's existence. We weren't father and son. We weren't even really friends. We were 2 people who happened to occupy the same space sometimes, navigating around each other like strangers in a crowded elevator. It wasn't ideal, but I told myself it was okay. Not every blended family is perfect, right? Some kids just need more time to adjust. I kept waiting for that adjustment to happen. It never did. The family that divided. Emily and I went on to have 3 kids together, a daughter who's now 10, and 2 sons who are 7 and 4. I love these kids with everything I have. They're funny, sweet, curious, and they brought so much joy into our lives. But James, he wanted nothing to do with them. His relationship with his half-siblings was practically non-existent. He wasn't outright cruel to them, I'll give him that much. He didn't bully them or hurt them, but he treated them like furniture, like they were just objects in the house that he had to navigate around. They'd try to engage with him, especially when they were younger and didn't understand why their big brother didn't want to play with them. But James would just ignore them, act like they weren't even there. Eventually, my 2 older kids learned to avoid him when he was home. They'd retreat to their rooms or go play outside when James was around. It broke my heart to watch them learn that their brother didn't want them, that they were somehow less than in his eyes. Meanwhile, at his father's house, James was apparently a completely different person. Dan had remarried his AP, and they'd gone on to have 2 sons together. James bonded beautifully with these half-brothers. He was the big brother they adored, laughing and playing and being the kind of sibling we never saw at our house. The contrast was painful. It made it clear that James was capable of being a good brother. He just chose not to be one to our kids. The therapy that never happened. Here's something people need to understand. Emily and I didn't just sit back and watch this situation unfold. We tried to get help. We tried multiple times over the years to get James into therapy. When Emily and I first started getting serious, when our relationship was clearly heading towards something permanent, Emily wanted to take James to a child therapist. She knew that her breakup with Dan, my entrance into their lives, and the upcoming changes would be a lot for a young child to process. She wanted to give him tools to handle it all in a healthy way. But because Emily and Dan shared 50-50 custody, both parents had to consent to therapy. Dan refused. He said there was nothing wrong with James and that therapy would make him feel like something was wrong with him when he was perfectly fine. Strike 1. When Emily and I were about to get married, we tried again. Surely, we thought, Dan would see the value in helping James adjust to another major change in his life. But Dan, who had gotten married to his AP a couple of months earlier, refused again. His reasoning? James was fine with Dan's marriage, so there was no reason he wouldn't be fine with ours. We were overreacting. Strike 2. When James was 13, he found out from an older cousin on Dan's side that his father had cheated on his mother, and that this was why Emily had left. When James confronted Emily about it, she was honest and open with him. She explained everything age-appropriately. When James confronted Dan, Dan spun it perfectly. And we'll get to that later. After that revelation, we tried for therapy again. Dan said we were trying to brainwash James, to instill thoughts in his head about how evil his father was. He refused to consent. Strike 3. When Emily was pregnant with our daughter, we requested therapy again. Dan's response: James was fine with Dan's sons, so therapy wasn't needed. Strike 4. We even consulted with our lawyer about whether we could approach the court and argue that Dan's repeated refusal of therapy was hampering our relationship with James. Our lawyer told us that technically Dan was right. James wasn't showing the same level of detachment with Dan's family that he was showing with ours. Pursuing it in court could have actually tilted the custody arrangement in Dan's favor, potentially reducing Emily's time with her son. We were trapped. Last year, when James was 16, something happened that made us realize just how poisoned he'd become. During a casual dinner table conversation, not even during an argument, James told his mother that he believed she was responsible for their family breaking up. He said instead of leaving Dan, she should have forgiven what he did and stayed with him. Emily, shocked, asked him if the situation was reversed. If she had cheated on Dan and Dan had left her, would Dan be blamed for the family breaking up? James said no, that would definitely be Emily's fault. He offered no further explanation. The logic didn't have to make sense. In James' mind, his mother was the villain no matter what. We had to excuse our other kids from the table that night. They were confused and upset, and we didn't want them to hear any more of this. After that incident, we tried one last time for therapy. James was 17 by then, almost an adult. We asked him directly, hoping that, if he agreed, we could work around the need for Dan's consent, since James was nearly a legal adult. James refused. His reason? I wasn't his family, so family therapy wasn't necessary. That was the moment I knew we'd lost this battle. The college fund arrangement. Despite everything, Emily and I both have well-paying jobs, and we wanted to make sure all the kids were taken care of when it came to college. Early in our marriage, we set up college funds for everyone. For our 3 kids together, I would contribute 80% and Emily would contribute 20%. For James, Emily would contribute 100%. The reasoning seemed sound. I wasn't James's father. Dan was alive, present, and actively involved in his son's life. We had no idea if Dan was setting anything aside for James, but we figured that at minimum, Emily's contributions would ensure James had something when the time came to apply to colleges. This arrangement existed quietly in the background for years. The kids were young, college was a distant concern, and nobody questioned it. We also made sure that James was never excluded from anything else in our family. When Emily and I both started earning good money, we liked to splurge on our kids during birthdays and holidays. James was never left out. Whatever our kids got, he got too. In fact, because he was older, he often got to pick what he wanted, while our younger kids were happy with whatever we chose for them. For his 11th birthday, James said he wanted to go to Disney World. We agreed. We even invited Dan's 2 sons to come with us. Dan's youngest son and our daughter were the same age, and we thought it would be a nice trip for everyone. James went to Disney World. Dan's sons went. We paid for all of it. But our daughter? She wasn't invited to Dan's house for a reciprocal trip or anything. We stayed home while James enjoyed what we'd given him. That was the pattern. We gave, we included, we tried. James took what we offered and gave nothing back. The explosion. Then James turned 17, and Emily sat him down to discuss his college fund. She wanted to be transparent with him about how much was there and what kind of schools it would cover. James seemed pleased with what she told him. For a moment, I thought maybe this would be a turning point, that he'd see we'd been looking out for him all along. Then he went to Dan's house for the weekend. When he came back, everything exploded. James came home and immediately asked Emily about our kids' college funds. Specifically, he asked about the amounts. When he learned that their funds were significantly higher than his, he was upset. When Emily explained our arrangement, that she'd been funding his account alone while we'd both been contributing to our children's funds together, he was furious. He accused me of pretending to play family with him all these years. He called me heartless. He said I'd never really cared about him, that it was all an act, that I was just going through the motions while secretly not giving a damn about his future. The irony was staggering. This kid who'd spent 12 years making it crystal clear that I meant nothing to him, that I was an unwanted intrusion in his life, that I would never be his family. This kid was suddenly hurt that I hadn't been treating him like a son? Emily, desperate to keep the peace and probably feeling guilty even though she had nothing to feel guilty about, suggested a compromise. She said we could take some money from our youngest son's fund and give it to James, and she'd replace it over time from her own earnings. But she left the decision entirely to me. She said she wouldn't pressure me either way and would accept whatever I decided. I thought about it. I really did, but I couldn't bring myself to agree. Call me petty, call me an asshole, but I couldn't do it. This kid worshipped his cheating father, blamed his mother for their family falling apart, refused to acknowledge my children as his siblings, and had spent over a decade making it crystal clear that I was an unwanted presence in his life. Now suddenly, when money was on the table, I was supposed to be family? No! I decided I wouldn't contribute to his fund. The internet weighs in. I posted about this situation online looking for perspective. Was I the asshole? Was I being unfair? I got hundreds of responses, some supportive, many critical. People pointed out that James was a kid, that I was the adult, that I should be the bigger person. Others pointed out that I'd signed up to be a stepfather, and that came with certain responsibilities. Some said I was justified, that you can't force a relationship where there isn't one, and that James had made his feelings clear. But the most impactful comments were the ones that questioned how we'd let things get this bad, how we'd allowed Dan to poison James against us without intervention, how we'd failed to protect James from parental alienation. Those comments stung, because they were partly right, but they also didn't understand the full picture. After reading through everything, Emily and I decided it was time for a real, honest conversation with James. No more tiptoeing around the issues. No more protecting anyone's feelings. We needed to know the truth of what had been happening in his head all these years. The conversation that changed everything. James didn't want to talk to me. He made that clear immediately. But I told him straight up, if he expected me to even consider contributing to his college fund, if he thought there was any possibility of me changing my mind, then I had questions that needed answers. Real answers. No more silence, no more tantrums, no more stonewalling. He agreed. Reluctantly. What came out in that conversation shattered everything we thought we understood about the situation. James started talking, and Emily and I just listened, trying to process what we were hearing. Even before Emily and Dan had broken up, Dan had occasionally been bringing James to his affair partner's house. James knew her. She wasn't a stranger to him. When the breakup happened and Dan immediately moved in with AP, James was going between two homes, one familiar and stable, one chaotic and struggling. See, Emily had been a stay-at-home mom when she was with Dan. When she left him, she had to rebuild everything from scratch. She had to find work, establish her career, and get back on her feet financially, all while being a single mother. Those early days were hard for her, and by extension, hard for James. His home life with Emily was stressful, unpredictable, and less comfortable than what he had at Dan's place. Emily had never told James that she'd left his father because of cheating. He was a toddler when it happened. How do you explain adult infidelity to a 3-year-old? It made no sense to burden him with that information at such a young age. But Dan had no such reservations about manipulating his son's understanding of reality. In those early days, before Dan married AP, he used to tell James that Emily would eventually come back to him. He planted that hope in his son's mind, that seed of expectation, that Mommy and Daddy would get back together. And then I came into the picture. Dan told James that as long as I was around, I wouldn't let Emily go back to Dan. According to Dan's narrative, I was the obstacle, the barrier keeping their family from reuniting. I was the villain preventing the happy ending. When Emily and I got married, Dan told James that I had trapped Emily, that I'd made it even more difficult for Emily to return to their real family. Every step of the way, Dan was rewriting reality for his son. The truth about Dan's cheating. When James was 13, he learned from an older cousin on Dan's side that his father had cheated on his mother and that this cheating was the reason for their breakup. This was information James hadn't known before, or at least not in explicit terms. He confronted Emily about it. Emily, true to her character, was honest and open with him. She explained what had happened, age appropriately, but truthfully. She didn't trash Dan, but she didn't lie about what he'd done either. Then James confronted Dan, and Dan spun it perfectly. He told James that Emily had left him alone for a long time, and his loneliness made him miss her so much that he sought comfort with AP. What actually happened was that Emily's father had been in a car accident, and Emily had spent 3 weeks with her parents helping them through the crisis. 3 weeks. That's all the alone time Dan could handle before he decided to cheat on the mother of his child. But in Dan's version, he was the victim. He was lonely, he missed Emily so much, he made a mistake in a moment of weakness. He framed it as Emily's abandonment leading to his infidelity, rather than his own choices, and James bought it completely. Dan's explanation was reasonable enough for James to absolve his father of all sins. In James' mind, his father wasn't a cheater. He was a man who'd been left alone and made an understandable mistake, the lies about our family. But Dan's manipulation didn't stop at rewriting the past. He actively worked to poison James against our future. When Emily got pregnant with our daughter, Dan told James something that I can barely stand to repeat. He told James that now that I was pumping my spawn into his mother, those were the exact words James used when recounting this to us, James's family was destroyed forever. The pregnancy wasn't a joyful expansion of James's family. It was the final nail in the coffin of his hopes for his parents' reunion. But Dan went even further than that. He told James that Emily and I wanting to take him to therapy was actually a ruse. According to Dan, we weren't trying to help James process his feelings or adjust to our blended family. No, we were trying to get a doctor to declare him a problem child so that we could ship him off to boarding school and play happy family without him bothering us. Only Dan and his family, James was told, were fighting to keep him. Only they truly loved him. Every single attempt we'd made to help this kid, every effort to get him professional support to navigate his complicated family situation had been twisted by his father into evidence of our villainy. We weren't trying to help James, we were trying to get rid of him. Let that sink in for a moment. For years, we'd been begging Dan to consent to therapy. For years, we'd been told we were overreacting, that James was fine, that we were the problem. And all along, Dan had been telling James that our efforts to help him were actually a conspiracy to remove him from Emily's life. James's confession. James admitted something else during our conversation, something that devastated Emily even more than Dan's lies. He'd been deliberately acting detached and cold with us while being warm and loving with Dan's family. It wasn't just natural preference or genuine connection. It was strategic, calculated. James had hoped that his behavior would convince Emily that my kids and I were the problem, that we made him miserable, that something was wrong with our family. He thought that if he could show her how happy he was with Dan and how unhappy he was with us, she'd eventually leave us. But I kept knocking up his mom, making it harder for her to leave. Each new child was another chain binding Emily to me, another obstacle to James's ultimate goal. Everything he'd done, all the coldness and rejection and detachment, had been part of a plan to break up our family. He was a child, yes, but he'd been actively working to destroy what Emily and I had built. The questions that needed answers. I asked James if Dan had a college fund set up for him. What about for Dan's sons with AP? The answer was illuminating and infuriating. AP's parents had set up a trust fund for Dan's sons, their biological grandchildren. But James wasn't included in that trust fund because he wasn't their grandson. And Dan? Dan hadn't saved a single penny for anyone. Not for his sons with AP, not for James, not for anyone. So Dan had spent years poisoning James against us, convincing him that we didn't care about him, that we were trying to push him out, all while doing nothing to actually support his son's future. Dan had contributed exactly $0 to James's education while criticizing the fact that I hadn't contributed either. The hypocrisy was staggering. I asked James the question that really mattered. Why did he suddenly think I should contribute to his fund when he'd turned down every single opportunity for us to be family? His answer was devastating in its honesty. He said he was actually okay with the amount Emily had initially told him about. It wasn't great, but it was something, and he'd accepted it. But then he went to Dan's house and talked to his father about it. Dan convinced him that we were shortchanging him, that we were being unfair, that he deserved more. So James came back to demand more money. It wasn't even his own idea. It was Dan pulling strings again. I asked James if I gave him the money, if I contributed to his fund to make it equal to our other kids' funds, would that make us family? Even if he couldn't accept me as a stepfather, could we at least be friends? Could he try to be a little more friendly with my kids when he was around our house? James looked at me and said no. He said that after all these years, he knew intellectually that my kids and I weren't the evil beings his father had made us seem. He could acknowledge that we weren't actually the villains Dan had painted us as. But emotionally, he still felt that I was the reason his parents could never get back together. And for that, he would always hate me. And since my kids were my kids, extensions of me, he was never going to like them either. He couldn't reconcile the cognitive dissonance. He knew the truth, but couldn't accept it. The plan to leave. Then James told us his plan for the future, and it broke Emily's heart all over again. He said that once he went off to college, he was going to cut off contact with all of us. Complete no contact. He'd block our numbers, refuse our emails, shut us out entirely. Eventually, he said, when he felt ready to forgive his mother for breaking up his family, he might get back in touch with her. But he couldn't say when that would be. Maybe in a few years? Maybe in a decade? Maybe never. But he certainly wasn't going to maintain any relationship with me or my kids. We were dead to him, and we would remain dead to him for the foreseeable future. Our decision. Emily and I talked for hours after that conversation. We've been to therapy before, individually and as a couple, because the stress of this situation has nearly broken us multiple times over the years. We knew we'd be going back again. But first, we needed to make decisions about James and his future. I told Emily I would not be contributing to James' college fund. After everything he said, after learning about Dan's manipulation and James's calculated coldness, after hearing that he would always hate me regardless of what I did, I couldn't do it. I wouldn't reward over a decade of rejection with money, especially when it wouldn't change anything between us. Emily agreed. She would continue the contributions she'd already been making, but no more. We also decided we were done pursuing family therapy with James. We'd tried for over a decade to get him help, to build some kind of relationship, to bring our family together. It hadn't worked. We were done fighting a battle we couldn't win. We wouldn't try to change James' mind about going no contact after college. If that's what he wanted, if that's what would make him happy, then we wouldn't stand in his way. We'd done all we could do. We'd tried every avenue available to us. We'd been blocked at every turn, either by Dan or by James himself. It was time to stop. If James was happy with Dan's family, if that's where he felt he belonged, then we'd let him go. It was going to be hard for Emily, watching her son choose the man who cheated on her and spent years poisoning their child against her. But after James' revelations, even Emily was struggling to reconcile the little boy she'd raised with this bitter, manipulated teenager who blamed her for everything wrong in his life. The aftermath. James disappears. After our long conversation, James didn't come home. He left and stayed with a friend for a few days, then went back to his father's place. He didn't reach out, didn't call, didn't text. Emily asked him to come over on Saturday. She wanted to have one more conversation with him, this time just her speaking and him listening. James came. Emily sat him down and told him that since he was hell-bent on giving up his relationship with us, there was no point in walking on eggshells around him anymore. No more pretending things were fine when they weren't. She told him she was hurt and disappointed by his behavior. She told him that for him to believe that she, the person who was cheated on, was to blame for their family breaking up was unacceptable. She told him that if he felt his father's cheating was forgivable and that she should just have gone back to a man who'd betrayed her, then she couldn't see eye to eye with him. She told him that I would not be contributing to his fund. Since he didn't think of me as family, I had no obligations to fund his education. If he felt his fund was lacking, he should ask Dan to make up the difference. Dan, who hadn't saved a penny for him. She also explained that he wouldn't be getting direct access to his funds. The money would be paid directly to whatever college he attended, ensuring that neither James nor Dan could misuse it. If James chose not to go to college, the money would be held until he turned 25. If something happened to Emily before James turned 25, our lawyer would be in charge of distributing the money at the appropriate time. This was to protect everyone and ensure Dan couldn't manipulate the situation further or blame me for interfering with James's money. Emily also told James that from now on, if he didn't want to come to our house, he didn't have to. She wasn't giving up custody yet. That was a legal matter that would take time, but she wasn't going to force him to stay with us according to the custody arrangement. If he was happier at Dan's, he could stay there. James listened to everything silently. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself, didn't try to explain himself. He just sat there and took it all in. That night, he didn't leave his room. The next morning, Sunday, he went back to Dan's place. We haven't heard anything from him since then. The questions we couldn't answer. After I posted updates about all of this online, people had a lot of questions and a lot of opinions. Many people asked how we didn't know that Dan was brainwashing James against us. The answer is, we did know that some level of parental alienation was happening. That's exactly why we kept pushing for therapy year after year. But we didn't know the extent of it. We didn't know the specific lies Dan was telling. We didn't know about the pumping my spawn into his mother comments or the boarding school conspiracy theories. Whenever we tried to talk to James about his feelings or his relationship with Dan, he'd either throw a tantrum or sit like a stone and refuse to say a word. Without therapy, without any professional intervention, we had no way to break through those walls. It wasn't until last year when James told Emily she was to blame for the family breaking up that we got our first real glimpse of how deeply Dan had poisoned him. And it wasn't until our recent conversation that we learned the full scope of the manipulation. Some people suggested we sue Dan for parental alienation. In theory, that's a great idea. In practice, it's nearly impossible. James will be 18 in a few months. We have no proof of anything Dan said to him. We didn't record our conversation with James, and even if we had, James wouldn't be a reliable witness. He'd lie to protect his father. We know he would. By the time any legal process would work its way through the system, James would be an adult and it wouldn't matter anymore. Others criticized Emily for telling James the amounts in the college funds. They said she should have kept that information private, that it was stupid of her to reveal the disparity. Emily explained what actually happened. James came back from Dan's house with questions about his fund, when it was started, how much was in it, how the contributions worked. He said something like, "So mine is blank and theirs is blank." He'd gotten bad information from Dan and was working off incorrect numbers that made it seem like his fund was larger than our kids' funds. Without thinking, and yes, she admits this was a mistake, Emily corrected him, "No, yours is blank and theirs is blank." It wasn't a diabolical plan to expose me or force me to contribute more. It was a thoughtless correction that spiraled into everything that followed. Real life isn't like movies or TV shows where characters always have the perfect response ready. When your son is standing there with completely wrong information, sometimes you correct him without thinking through the consequences. Emily wishes she'd handled it differently, but hindsight is 20/20. Moving forward, Emily has made some changes to her plan for James's college fund based on advice from the internet and from our lawyer. While she'll continue to add to James's fund until he turns 18, she will not be handing the money directly to him. Instead, she'll pay it directly to whatever institution James attends. This protects the money from being misused and ensures it goes toward James's education as intended. If James chooses not to go to college, the money will be held in the account and given to him when he turns 25. By that age, hopefully he'll have more maturity and perspective. If Emily passes away before James turns 25, our lawyer will be in charge of managing the fund and distributing it at the appropriate time. This structure ensures that neither James nor Dan can claim I interfered with the money or manipulated the situation. It's handled entirely by Emily and, if necessary, by a neutral third party. Emily also told James that she's no longer enforcing the custody arrangement. While she's not legally giving up custody yet, she's not going to force him to come to our house if he doesn't want to be there. She's talked to our lawyer about this, and while it's not ideal legally, it's better than forcing a 17-year-old to stay somewhere he doesn't want to be. If James is happier at Dan's house, if that's where he feels he belongs, then that's where he can stay. As for Emily and me, we're going back to therapy. We've done individual and couples therapy before to deal with the stress and anxiety that this situation has caused over the years. We need professional help to process everything that's come out recently, to heal from the betrayal and manipulation, and to figure out how to move forward as a family of 5 instead of 6. Our 3 younger kids have grown up watching their older half-brother reject them. They've learned that James doesn't want them, doesn't like them, wishes they didn't exist. That's a painful lesson for children to learn, and they deserve parents who can help them process that pain and understand that it's not their fault. Emily is particularly devastated. She's having a hard time reconciling the little boy she raised, the toddler she protected and cared for, with this bitter, manipulated teenager who blames her for everything. She's grieving the loss of her son, even though he's still alive, because the person he's become is so different from the child she knew. I'm not going to pretend I'm not affected by all of this, too. I spent 12 years trying to be a good stepfather to a kid who hated me. I tried to include him, to care for him, to give him space when he needed it, and support when he'd accept it. And all along, he was actively working to destroy my family. Yes, he's a kid. Yes, he was manipulated. But knowing that doesn't make it hurt less. Reflection and regret. People have pointed out that the adults in James's life, Emily, Dan, me, collectively failed him. And they're right. We did. Emily and I should have fought harder to get him into therapy. We should have gone to court earlier, pushed back against Dan's refusals more aggressively, documented everything better. Maybe if we'd done things differently, we could have gotten a judge to mandate therapy regardless of Dan's consent. But we were operating in an impossible situation. Our lawyer told us that pursuing therapy through the courts could backfire and result in Emily losing custody time. James showed attachment to Dan's family and detachment from ours, which could have been used against Emily in court. We were trying to protect Emily's relationship with her son while also trying to help him. We were stuck between a rock and a hard place, and in the end, maybe we chose wrong. Dan, of course, failed James worst of all. He spent years poisoning his son against the woman who raised him, filling his head with lies, manipulating his understanding of reality. Dan put his own ego and his own hurt feelings above his son's well-being. He turned James into a weapon against Emily and me. And in doing so, he robbed James of half his family. When James eventually realizes what his father did to him, if he ever does, I don't know how he'll cope with that revelation. Am I the asshole? So, am I the asshole for not wanting to contribute to my stepson's college fund? I've made my peace with my decision. I know some people will judge me for it. I know some people think I should be the bigger person, that I should contribute to his fund regardless of our relationship, that I should prove to him that I care even if he doesn't care about me. But I can't do that. I can't reward over a decade of calculated rejection with money, especially when I know it won't change anything. James has made it clear that no amount of money will make us family. He'll take what I give and still hate me, still blame me for his parents not getting back together, still cut me out of his life the moment he turns 18. You can't force someone to be family. You can't buy love or respect or even basic human decency with money. And you certainly can't heal a relationship that's been poisoned by years of parental alienation with a check. James made his choices, influenced by his father's lies, but ultimately his own. Now he has to live with the consequences of those choices. He chose Dan's family over ours, chose manipulation over truth, chose resentment over healing. That's his right. He's entitled to his feelings, even if those feelings are based on lies. But I'm also entitled to my feelings. I'm entitled to protect myself and my family from someone who's actively worked to destroy us. I'm entitled to say no to funding the future of someone who's told me he'll always hate me. Emily supports my decision. She understands why I can't contribute, and she doesn't blame me for it. She's dealing with her own grief and disappointment, but she knows that I tried. We both tried. Our 3 younger kids are innocent in all of this. They didn't ask to have a half-brother who resents their existence. They didn't choose to be born into this complicated situation. They deserve parents who are present and whole and capable of giving them the love and attention they need. And that's what Emily and I are going to focus on now. Our family of 5, the family that actually wants to be together. The silence. It's been weeks since James went back to Dan's house after Emily's final conversation with him. We haven't heard a word. No texts, no calls, no messages through mutual friends or family members. Part of me wonders what Dan is telling him now. Is he spinning this into another story about how we've abandoned James? How we've proven we never cared about him? Is he using Emily's decision not to force custody visits as evidence that she's giving up on her son? Or is Dan just relieved to have won, to have successfully alienated James from us so completely that he doesn't even have to share custody anymore? I don't know, and honestly, I'm trying not to think about it too much. Emily checks James' social media sometimes, just to make sure he's okay. He posts pictures from Dan's house, smiling with his half-brothers, looking happy. It hurts her to see him thriving in a home where she's not welcome, but at least he's safe and seemingly healthy. That's all she can hope for at this point. What I've learned. This entire experience has taught me some hard lessons about blended families, parental alienation, and the limits of love and good intentions. I've learned that you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. You can't force healing on someone who's committed to staying wounded. You can't build a relationship with someone who's been taught to see you as the enemy, no matter how hard you try. I've learned that sometimes being a good parent means knowing when to step back. Emily isn't abandoning James by not forcing custody visits. She's respecting his clearly stated wishes while keeping the door open for if and when he's ready to walk back through it. I've learned that parental alienation is real. It's devastating, and it's incredibly difficult to fight, especially when the legal system isn't set up to recognize and address it effectively. I've learned that some battles can't be won, and continuing to fight them only causes more damage to everyone involved. Most importantly, I've learned that I need to let go of the resentment I've been carrying. Not for James's sake, he doesn't care about my feelings, but for my own sake, and for the sake of my family. Holding on to anger and hurt about James's rejection is only poisoning my own well-being and affecting my ability to be fully present for the 3 kids who do want me in their lives. The future. I don't know what the future holds for James. I hope he goes to college, uses the money Emily has saved for him, and builds a good life for himself. I hope he eventually sees through his father's manipulation and recognizes the truth about what happened. I hope he finds peace and happiness, even if that happiness doesn't include us. I hope that someday, when he's older and has more life experience, he'll reach out to his mother and they can rebuild some kind of relationship. Emily deserves that. She's a good mother who was put in an impossible situation and did the best she could with the options available to her. But I'm not holding my breath for any of that. I'm not sitting around waiting for James to have an epiphany and apologize. I'm not expecting him to show up one day and want to be part of our family. I'm moving forward with the family I have, Emily and our 3 kids who love us and want us and choose us every single day. As for whether I'm the asshole for not contributing to James's college fund, I've stopped caring about that question. I made the decision that was right for me, for my family, and for my own mental health and well-being. James has made his choices, I've made mine, and now we all have to live with the consequences. That's the story. It's messy, it's painful, and it doesn't have a happy ending, but it's real and it's ours, and we're doing the best we can with the cards we've been dealt. If you're reading this and you're in a similar situation, dealing with a hostile childhood, navigating parental alienation, trying to blend a family that doesn't want to blend, please know you're not alone. Please know that it's okay to set boundaries. It's okay to prioritize your own well-being and the well-being of the family members who want to be part of your life. You can't set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm, especially when that someone is actively pouring gasoline on the flames. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let go. Related comments. NTA. But I'm going to be honest with you. This whole situation makes me incredibly sad for everyone involved, especially James. Look, I get it. You tried. You really did. But reading through this, I can't help but notice that you and Emily made some critical mistakes early on that compounded over time. When Dan refused therapy the first time, you should have immediately gone to court. Not years later when it was too late, but right then. A good family lawyer could have argued that Dan's refusal was not in James's best interest, especially given the major life changes happening. You say your lawyer told you it might backfire because James showed attachment to Dan's family, but that's exactly why he needed therapy. That's textbook parental alienation, and courts do recognize it when it's properly documented and presented. I'm not saying you're the asshole for not contributing to the fund. Honestly, at this point, it wouldn't matter if you gave him $1 million. Dan has done his job too well. But I think you need to acknowledge that the adults in James's life, all of them, including you and Emily, failed to protect him from his father's psychological abuse. Because that's what parental alienation is. It's abuse. That poor kid never stood a chance. Author. You're not wrong, and believe me, Emily and I have had this conversation with ourselves and our therapist many times. Looking back, yes, we should have been more aggressive legally from the start, but at the time, we were operating with the information and advice we had. Our lawyer genuinely believed pushing too hard could result in Emily losing custody time, and that terrified us both. The system isn't set up to handle parental alienation well. It's hard to prove, easy to deny, and by the time it's obvious enough to be actionable, the damage is usually already done. We were stuck between potentially making things worse legally and hoping things would improve as James got older. They didn't improve. You're right about that. Comment. YTA. And I'll probably get downvoted to hell for this, but whatever. You married a woman with a child. That was your choice. When you marry someone with kids, those kids become your responsibility too, whether they like you or not. You don't get to pick and choose which children in your household deserve your support based on how nice they are to you. James was 3 years old when you came into his life, a toddler. And yes, his dad poisoned him against you, but you're the adult here. You should have been the bigger person. Instead, you're holding a grudge against a teenager who's been manipulated his entire childhood. Also, let's talk about the college fund disparity. You set this up when your daughter was born, which means James was around 7 to 8 years old. So for his entire childhood, he's watched you treat your real kids better than him financially. Even if he didn't know the specific numbers, kids pick up on this stuff. They know when they're being treated as less than. You created a two-tiered family system, and now you're shocked that he feels like an outsider? Come on, man. The right thing to do here is to equalize the funds. Not because James has been nice to you, he hasn't, but because it's the right thing to do for a child you've raised since he was 3 years old. Sometimes being a parent means doing the right thing even when it's hard and even when you don't get credit for it. Author, I hear what you're saying, but I fundamentally disagree with the premise that I'm obligated to financially support a child who has a living, involved father who chooses not to support him. Dan sees James constantly. Dan has influence over James. Dan has the ability to save for James' education, but chooses not to. Why is it my responsibility to make up for Dan's failures when Dan actively worked to turn James against me? I didn't create the two-tiered system out of malice. Emily and I discussed it thoroughly and agreed that she would fund James while we'd both fund our children together. That seemed fair given the circumstances. Emily was a stay-at-home mom when she was with Dan and couldn't start saving for James until she was back on her feet financially. By the time she could save, we were having our own children. And for the record, we never treated James as less than in any other way. He got the same gifts, the same trips, the same opportunities. The only difference was the college fund contribution split, which he didn't even know about until recently. Comment. NTA at all. And I'm speaking as someone who was in James' position as a kid. My parents divorced when I was 4. My dad remarried when I was 6, and my mom got together with my stepdad when I was 7. My dad spent years telling me that my stepdad was the reason my parents weren't together. They'd been divorced for 3 years before my mom even met him, but whatever. He told me my stepdad was trying to replace me, that my mom loved her new family more than me, all that rubbish. And you know what? I believed it. I was awful to my stepdad and my half-siblings. I was cold, distant, rude when I could get away with it. I blamed them for everything wrong in my life. Then I turned 19 and moved out on my own. Away from both households, I finally had space to think for myself. And slowly, over about 2 years, I started to see how much my dad had manipulated me. I started to remember things that didn't line up with his narrative. I started to realize that my stepdad had been nothing but kind to me, and I'd been an absolute prick to him for over a decade. I ended up reaching out to my mom and stepdad and apologizing. It took time to rebuild that relationship, but we have one now. I'm 34 now, and my stepdad is one of my best mates. I wish I hadn't wasted so many years being angry at people who didn't deserve it. But here's the thing. They didn't owe me that second chance. They gave it to me because they're good people. But I had to do the work. I had to recognize what had happened, take responsibility for my actions, even though I was manipulated, and make amends. OP, you don't owe James anything at this point. You tried for 12 years. Maybe one day he'll have his own revelation like I did, and maybe he'll reach out. Or maybe he won't. But either way, you've done enough. Protect yourself and your family. Author. Thank you for sharing your story. It gives me some hope that maybe James will eventually see things differently, even if it takes years. Can I ask, what finally made you start questioning your dad's narrative? Was there a specific incident, or was it just gradual realization over time? Answer to author. Honestly, mate, it was a combination of things. Living on my own meant I wasn't hearing my dad's voice in my ear constantly, which helped. But the real turning point was when I started dating seriously. And my girlfriend, now wife, pointed out some things that didn't make sense in the stories I told her about my family. She asked really simple questions like, if your stepdad was so terrible, why did your mom stay with him for 15 years? And if they wanted to get rid of you, why did they keep fighting for custody? Just basic logic stuff that I'd never really thought about because I'd been so deep in my dad's version of events. It was uncomfortable as hell to realize I'd been wrong for so long. Took me another year after that to actually reach out. Pride's a hell of a thing. Comment. Family law attorney here. I've seen dozens of cases like this, and I have to say, the legal system failed this child spectacularly. Everything OP describes is textbook parental alienation. Dan's behavior should have been addressed by the courts years ago. The problem is that many judges don't recognize parental alienation or don't want to deal with it because it's complicated and messy. A few things that stand out to me. 1. Dan's repeated refusal to consent to therapy should have been a massive red flag to the court. When one parent consistently blocks mental health treatment for a child showing signs of distress, that's a problem. 2. The fact that James behaves completely differently in each household is classic alienation behavior. This should have been documented and presented to the court. 3. OP mentioned that their lawyer advised against pursuing court action because it might backfire. While I understand that concern, I think OP needed a more aggressive attorney. There are ways to handle these cases that minimize risk. That said, OP is NTA for the college fund decision. At this point, the damage is done. Contributing money won't undo years of psychological manipulation. The sad reality is that James is nearly an adult now, and he's going to have to figure this out on his own. My only advice for OP is document everything from here on out. Every conversation, every message, every interaction. If James does eventually come around and Dan tries to interfere, you'll want that documentation. Also, make sure Emily's will is ironclad around James' fund. You don't want Dan getting his hands on it if something happens to Emily. Comment. I'm going to say something that might be unpopular. ESH except the younger kids. Dan is obviously the biggest AH here for alienating James from his mother. No question about that. But Emily really dropped the ball here. She's James's mother. She should have fought harder, sued for full custody, documented everything, and protected her son from Dan's manipulation. Instead, she just let it happen. For 14 years, she watched her son being turned against her and did what exactly? And OP, you're not innocent either. You say you tried, but did you really? You came on too strong when he was a toddler and then just backed off completely? You let a small child dictate the terms of your relationship? You built a family that clearly separated our kids from Emily's kid, even if you didn't mean to. James is a victim here. He's a kid who was manipulated by his father, failed by the legal system, and treated as an outsider in his own mother's home. Yes, he's been awful to you and your kids, but he's a traumatized teenager who's been fed poison his whole life. I'm not saying you have to give him money, but maybe everyone needs to take a hard look at their choices over the past 14 years and recognize that the adults failed this child. Author. You're right that Emily could have fought harder legally, but you're not accounting for the reality of family court. Her lawyer genuinely advised that pushing too hard could result in her losing custody time. Judges don't always rule the way you'd expect, and sometimes they punish the parent who seems difficult or unwilling to co-parent. As for me backing off, I didn't back off completely. I gave him space instead of forcing a relationship. There's a difference. I was still present, still involved in his life, still trying to include him in everything we did. But I wasn't going to force hugs or demand he call me dad or make him participate in family activities against his will. That would have pushed him further away. The our kids versus Emily's kid thing hurts because we genuinely tried not to create that dynamic. James created it himself by refusing to participate in family life and by bonding with Dan's kids while rejecting ours. But you're right that we all failed him. I've acknowledged that. The question is, what do we do now? At what point are we allowed to stop beating ourselves up and move forward? Comment. Licensed family therapist here, and I just want to say that this is one of the most heartbreaking cases of parental alienation I've seen described on Reddit. For those saying OP and Emily should have done more, you're not wrong, but you're also not accounting for how difficult these situations are to navigate. Parental alienation is insidious, precisely because it's hard to prove and hard to fight. The alienating parent, Dan, appears reasonable to outsiders while systematically destroying the child's relationship with the other parent. James is going to need years of therapy to undo this damage if he ever recognizes it. Many alienated children never do. They carry their distorted view of reality into adulthood and pass it on to their own children. OP, you're not NTA for protecting yourself and your family at this point. But I want to stress something. If James eventually comes around, he's going to need grace and forgiveness that he doesn't deserve. He's going to need to be welcomed back, even though he rejected you for years. That's going to be incredibly difficult. Start working on that in therapy now. Not because James has earned it, but because holding on to resentment will only hurt you. Also, please make sure your 3 younger children get therapy too. They've watched their brother reject them for years. That trauma needs to be addressed before it affects their own relationships and self-esteem. Good luck to all of you. This is a tragedy all around. Author, thank you for your professional perspective. Emily and I are already back in therapy, and we're planning to get our kids into therapy as well. Our daughter especially has struggled with understanding why James doesn't like her. You're right that if James comes around eventually, we'll need to be ready to forgive. I'm working on that, but I'd be lying if I said I'm there yet. Right now, I'm just tired and hurt and trying to focus on the family I have. Write what you think about this situation. Also, if you like this video, give a thumbs up, subscribe, and turn on the bell to receive notifications about the latest videos. See you next time. Bye-bye.